affect the atrium, ventricle, or both. Tachycardia detection, the source of the, how does it detect? It could be hemodynamic changes or it could be from the ECG. And anti-bradycardia pacing chambers. It could be, it can pace the atrium, ventricle, or both. So these are all the classification of these devices. One we saw was for the classification of the pacemakers or the cardiac implantable electrical devices. The second is for this. Most hospitals, especially corporate hospitals or those with NABH accreditation or JIC accreditation, use the ICD code. So the ICD code for CIED is ICD 10CM code Z95, which indicates the presence of a cardiac pacemaker. So what is important for us to understand is what are the factors which interfere with the function of this device. And most of the time it is electromagnetic interference. So we have cell phones on our in the hospital. We carry once it rings. There are other devices like the electrocautery, and there are so many other such electromagnetic sources within the hospital. So radio frequency waves are basically between 0 and 10 to the power of 9 hertz, and microwaves are beyond that, 10 to the power of 9 to 10 to the power of 11 hertz. Higher frequency waves in the form of X-rays, gamma rays, infrared, ultraviolet, they do not cause any interference. So how do they interfere with the function of these devices? There is a potential for disruption by electrocautery or any other electronic equipment that I have mentioned. So what is important is it depends upon whether monopolar or bipolar cautery current is used. So the magnitude of disruption depends on whether these two types of cautery current are used. So in the form of cautery, if you use monopolar, the current impulse is perceived as an aberrant cardiac impulse, which can either inhibit or trigger the device, and this can result in various catastrophic consequences. It can trigger off different kinds of rhythms or cause a malignant dysrhythm. Bipolar leads that way are less vulnerable or less likely to cause any changes because they have a larger what is called an antenna loop. So that is why they are less likely. And newer devices or devices which are available are also protected from these by having casing of the device made of titanium, and this shields the device or the source, the pulse generator, from all these extraneous or EMIs, and it also has some incorporated noise protection algorithm built in. So what are the implications, like I said, for the use of or the from EMI? One is that it can undersense. That is, the device can fail to detect any intrinsic atrial or ventricular activity because of the source or the external interference by electromagnetic interference. So what happens? It can overpace. This can occur where the pulse generator fires despite intrinsic activity with the potential for malignant disturbance. So there is a normal rhythm happening. So because there is undersensing of this rhythm, it thinks that there is nothing there. So it can trigger off as there's some disturbance. So it can trigger off a malignant tachydystonia. So oversensing is also happening, which means it can oversense the EMI is taken as an inappropriate myocardial activity where there is none. So this can cause oversensing, and this will inhibit the device to pace when there is actually zero electrical or normal or intrinsic electrical activity. So the most common interference with electromagnetic interference devices or sources is oversensing. So let us look at some of the sources of interference in the hospital. Electrocautery is the first one. Radio frequency current is basically used. And like we said, there are unipolar or bipolar configurations. In a unipolar configuration, the anode plate is attached to the patient's skin. So the source or the electrocautery is about to the power of 3 or 5 hertz, so kilohertz. It's 300 to 500. So this is basically related to the distance and orientation of current to the patient's device and the leads. can also use diathermy or electrocautery are both similar devices. So whereas diathermy is shortwave diathermy applied directly to the skin. So whenever it is used, you should avoid it near the generator or the pulse generator side. So this can also cause overheating of the generator circuitry and can cause damage to the electronic components. So coming to evaluation or preoperative assessment of these patients, one is that you have to identify the pacemaker. So this can be done by basically looking at the whatever they have some kind of paperwork associated with this. You can look at the source or the notes that they have from the either the company or the manufacturer or the cardiologist who has placed or the electrophysiologist who has placed. Second is you need to know the pacing mode. Next is you have to have a knowledge of the primary indication of pacing for this patient. Then you have to know when the device was implanted. Then you have to know when and where it was last checked. Usually they have some routine for checking it. Then you have to know the anatomical position of the current active generator. Usually it is kept subclavicular in adult patients. In children, because it is a larger device, it is sometimes kept on the anterior abdominal wall. So you need to know where it is located. Then you have to know about the status of the battery and how do you reset the device so that you can bring it back to an asynchronous mode. And of course, you have to understand that there is a confirmation of satisfactory threshold. Threshold for stimulation is something which changes over time. So as soon as the lead is implanted, it is able to, because it's directly touching the myocardium, the amount of the resistance offered is very low and the amount of current required is not much. But as time happens, there is some fibrosis around the lead tip and it gets implanted. So that is why they are constantly interrogated over time. I'll show you in the next couple of slides the routine for doing it before the final amount of current and the resistance is recorded and the current set and the programs are set. There is always a problem when you use battery powered ones because source can fail. So what do you do next in preoperative assessment? You take a 12-lead ECG. So if you have an idea about what a pacemaker is being placed for, you can confirm the function of the pacemaker by means of the 12-lead ECG. Then you can look at the polarity of the pacing, and then you can assess the baseline rate of the pulse generator. So if you see, there is a small spike here, a small spike here, and a small spike here. So these are all atrial pacing spikes. These small arrows which precede the epi wave, which means it is the chamber phase with the atrium. So these are all followed. Whenever you have an AV conduction system which is normal, you will have a normal width of the QRS component. So it is very important to look at the QRS component and where the pacing spike is located. So here it is located just prior to the P wave. That is an atrial. This is an atrial device or the atrial pacing. If you see here, you will notice that there is no P wave and there is a large spike. Generally, the ventricle directly stimulated, you require larger amounts of energy to stimulate the ventricle. So it is very close to the QRS complex, and whenever you are directly stimulating the ventricle, you have ventricular pacing spikes as well as broad QRS complexes. So to determine if you see a spike very close to the QRS and the QRS is broad, then the chamber paced is the ventricle. This is telemetry data from an implantable cardioverter device. You will notice that there is a tachycardia. So there is a malignant or a dysrhythmia, supraventricular tachycardia, where there is a P wave. So the 14 joules have been applied to the devices that delivered a 14 joule shock, and then you see some kind of rhythm being restored. This is the brady dysrhythmias that have happened after a tachydysrhythmia. So this has functioned as an anti-tachycardia pacemaker, and now you have a bradydysrhythmia. So this will now, the device should kick off an anti-bradycardia function and start pacing at a fixed rate. So what do you do next? You look for a chest X-ray. Chest X-ray is very important because the nature and function of the device can be determined. This is very important if you have a patient who doesn't know what device has been placed for him, or he comes unconscious to you in the emergency department, or there is no relative to tell you what it was placed. So at least you'll get some information. So if you look at a chest X-ray, if you see multiple leads coming out from a device, these complicate or devices which have other functions or multiple functions are generally larger, and you see a lot of circuitry with plenty of wires. So this is basically a device. So if you look at it, there are three of them. One is in the right ventricle, one is in the right atrium, and another device is somewhere in the left ventricle. So this is in the coronary side, and this is the pacemaker or pulse generator. So this is basically a right atrial and right ventricular lead with one in the left ventricle. So this is a biventricular pacing system, which is used in patients with heart failure. So it is a cardiac resynchronization therapy device with only pacing function. So CRTP. So if you see a patient like this, you know that if he has got a CRT device, that means he had it placed for heart failure. So you have got information about his basic cardiac condition and also the type of device that is being used. This is an example of what is commonly happening, or newer devices which are there, which is called leadless pacemaker system. They are just implanted in the right ventricle and they keep pacing the patient. So it is a very minute device that is kept in the right ventricle. So when you don't have access to the heart, they can also keep a device which is subcutaneous with a lead, and a thick lead is basically used for, these are called shock coils. So it is basically for shocking. So yes, this is subcutaneous implantable cardiovertebral device. So this is basically a device which is a cardiac resynchronization therapy defibrillator. So you see two shock coils placed in the right ventricle and somewhere in the SVC-RA junction. You have one more in the right atrial lead, the fourth one in the left ventricular coronary sinus. So this is basically a defibrillator, so cardiac resynchronization therapy. So this patient is, obviously we know now that this patient will have or is prone to malignant dysrhythmias like repeated VT and VN. So these patients could also be on multiple antidysrhythmic drugs also. This is a complication of device placement, which is basically a lead which has come out of the right ventricle and is sticking out outside the heart. So you get plenty of information about, just by taking a chest X-ray, about the type of device, what has it been placed for. So that's what you should be looking at. So like I told you earlier, whenever you place a device, there is something called device interrogation. This is done by radio frequency or telemetry as it's called. So the Heart Rhythm Society recommends that whenever a AICD is placed within 6 months, or if it is a conventional pacemaker or permanent pacemaker or pulse generator within 12 months, and if it is for a resynchronization therapy, then within 3 to 6 months you should interrogate the device. So when do you say a patient is pacemaker dependent? A patient is pacemaker dependent where there is more than 40% of pacing burden, or the patient more than 40% of the time he requires pacemaker. And pacing spikes, we see P wave or the QRS based on whether it is atrial or ventricular pacing in almost all the ECG complexes, or predominant pacing rhythm in the ECG trace. There might be some amount of normal intrinsic rhythm and mostly pacing rhythm. So these are the kinds of patients who are called pacemaker dependent. It is very important that you determine whether this patient is pacemaker dependent or not, so that you can, during intraoperative period, you can, or with the pre-op, you can use appropriate instructions for managing the device. So when do you need to reprogram these devices? Reprogramming is just not It does not protect against damage to the pulse generator or a reset caused by the EMI. So basically, you must understand that if there is an electrical source or another energy source, it can damage the pulse generator. So the indications for reprogramming are significant pacemaker dependency, or if it has a defibrillator function, or if it has advanced CID functions where you have to disable the rate responsiveness and other such enhancements, or whether there are some special pacing indications. So when these indications are there, you need to reprogram the device before you take up for anesthetic, for giving anesthesia. Because any of the EMIs that we talked about, the electromechanical infusion or any other thing, can cause the pacemaker to behave inappropriately and cause more problems. So basic thing is that you reprogram it to make it a asynchronous. So the ACC-AHA recommends that all anti-tachycardia therapy function should be disabled before anesthesia is administered. It's so easy to think that, just to increase your heart rate, you can increase the, we all say, go, you have to maintain a heart rate of 100 plus for a few minutes to get your requisite exercise. So it is so easy to do that if you have a pacemaker. So what is the role of a magnet? We always say, when you say pacemaker in the exam, they say what is the role of a magnet. So for that you need to understand that there is something called a reed switch. So the reed switch is basically, there are two magnetic strips with the cantilever functions based in a small glass capsule. So they are generally in an open they're called it is a open system, or the reed switch is left in an open configuration. So when you apply it, so in this configuration, there is no contact between these two. So which means that the system is available for, or the device can basically go into all kinds of pacing programmability that it is meant for. Whereas as soon as you place a magnet, the lower device, this is just like our, for an analogy, if you remember our vaporizers, for directing the flow or increasing or decreasing, you have a bimetallic strip. So it is a similar thing. So as soon as you keep a magnet, these two come together, a voltage is generated, and this disrupts the circuitry and they go into a pre-programmed mode. So as soon as you place it, then it goes into what is called the asynchronous mode. So a reed switch magnetically activated, like here, when you close it, it enables alteration of the pacing or the defibrillator. So this is how you can either you reprogram it by telemetry, or you use a magnet to go back into the asynchronous. So it delivers a asynchronous mode at a specific rate that is already predetermined. So it is called AOO, VOO, or DOO. So an asynchronous mode, you should understand, might not be optimal. So it could be suboptimal in a patient with an underlying native disease. So you should take a call about placing a magnet in the OT. You should have a magnet on the table or available, but don't put it, because if the native rate or rhythm or rate is it's a AV conduction abnormality with a very low rate, then it might not be good for the patient. So you should also be careful when you use a magnet. The removal of the magnet at the end of the surgery will keep it back in the open position, and it will reset the function. So this will mean that the functions of the pacemaker is restored. So coming to intraoperative care, you should always, like I said, consider the cardiac state, the comorbidities, and what type of surgical intervention is being planned. So from our side, anything which can cause change in electrical polarity or disturbances to the conduction system, namely hypoxia, hypercapnia, acidosis, and electrolyte imbalances, especially potassium, should be avoided, because these may precipitate dysrhythmias or and interfere with pacemaker capture. So the amount of, in these conditions, the amount of voltage required to capture might be very high. So you should avoid that. So like I said, you identify the device and know how it will respond to electrocapnic cautery, keep up the backup mode, and confirm the hemodynamic stability of the patient. In patients with implantable defibrillators, you should always keep an electrical or an external defibrillator available, preferably with transcutaneous paddles. So transcutaneous electrodes are kept in an anterior-posterior configuration. Usually they should be kept 90 degrees or perpendicular to the device so that it does not interfere with the device function, and at least 10 to 15 centimeters away from the edge of the device. So the best is to keep it in an AP configuration. And but whenever in the presence of an AI defibrillator which has been reprogrammed or brought to an asynchronous mode, all dysrhythmia should be treated as we know with the ALS protocols. So how do you monitor these patients in the intraoperative period? Apart from the minimum mandated monitoring, you should also have other sources which can pick up the mechanical component of the myocardial function. So one is the ECG, which displays and demonstrates pacing spikes, and this can basically cause disturbances because of diathermy. So you may have double sensing. One is that there could be the sensing from the electrical source or the cautery or EMI source, as well as the native rhythm and the spacing spike. So the heart rate could be very erroneously very high. So the best is to have a pulse plethysmogram along. So if your pulse oximeter has a plethysmographic display, it will pick up the mechanical component of the cardiac cycle. So that is one. The best would be, of course, to have invasive arterial blood pressure monitoring, because this gives you beat-to-beat mechanical capture, especially in patients with heart failure, where the cardiac output might be low and might not be appropriate for the patient. So whenever you have to place a central venous line, be careful, because within 3 months of placement of leads, it has not yet taken, it has not yet rooted, or it has not yet been firmly fixed to the myocardial surface or the endocardial surface. So if you put a central line, it could displace the leads. And the mode of the implantable device should always be changed to asynchronous whenever you are placing a central venous catheter, especially from the internal or the external jugular or the subclavian routes. So these are some examples. This is basically atrial. If you see, the first few ECG waves are normal. You have an atrial or a P wave followed by a QRS complex, and then here probably there is an aberrant rhythm. So this shows atrial pacing. Atrial, this is sensing an aberrant rhythm, and it is inhibiting. So if you have an atrial or a normal P wave, the device is inhibited. So this is a AAI mode. This is basically a dual chamber pacing, that is, it is both the atrium and the ventricle. So this is basically a atrial sense. This means this patient has probably got a complete heart block. AV conduction abnormality is there. So you have an atrial spike and a pacing ventricular spike. So you have both of them. So this is dual chamber pacing. Dual chamber pacing is very important because your atrial component or the atrial kick or the atrial component of the cardiac the P wave itself is maintains the cardiac output better than either atrial or ventricular pacing alone. So coming to anesthetic function, anesthesia and the CID device, one is you must understand that none of the anesthetic drugs or molecules that we use per se, they do not interfere with the device and the electrical properties that are associated with it or the myocardial function per se. Whereas in patients with prolonged QT interval syndrome, so especially now in COVID times, you should understand patients getting, say, hydroxychloroquine or remdesivir, any of these drugs, they are likely to cause prolongation or interference with the QT interval. So in these patients, you should avoid serotonergic drugs like ondansetron, methadone, haloperidol, and high inspired levels of inhaled air, so that they do not cause further prolongation of QT interval and cause the device or CID to function or malfunction. Again, Molecules like fentanyl and dexmedetomidine cause significant bradycardia, especially in higher doses, or dexmedetomidine when you give a large bolus dose to start with. So you should use them very judiciously in the presence of a CID. Drugs like succinylcholine or succinylcholine, they should be used with caution because fasciculations may cause oversensing. Like I told you earlier, it can cause oversensing, and if the pacemaker is in an inhibitory mode, it can result in pacemaker being inhibited. So you can, if you have no choice, use rocuronium or use precurization for before you use succinylcholine. Please understand and remember that both general anesthesia and regional anesthesia are very safe in these patients. Patients with hypovolemia, there is a problem basically because in patients with CID in fixed or asynchronous mode, when there is a programmability about this, that programmability function of increasing the heart rate when there is low volume or increasing it for needs like tachycardia is not available. So reflex tachycardia because of hypovolemic situations will not be manifest in an asynchronous mode. So at least in these patients or where you expect some problems to arise because of volume changes or massive volume requirements are needed, then direct arterial or invasive arterial pressure monitoring or cardiac output monitoring should be used for prompt volume replacement, and this should be done as appropriated whenever appropriate. Regarding the use of cautery, you should always discuss this with your surgical colleagues, and they should also actually be well versed with the problems related to the presence of a pacemaker or a device in these patients. So they should use very short bursts and judiciously, that means whenever it is required. So 1 second at a time with an interval of 10 seconds. And if it is a monopolar, then the return current plate or the anode should be kept as far away from the patient's pulse generator or away from the direction of current, and it should not go through the pulse generator. Generally, this is not a problem for us because, like I said, even in children, it is kept in the anterior-abdominal wall, or in adults, it is in the subclavicular area. So, if you keep it on the foot or the anywhere in the lower limb, then the recommended distance of more than 10 to 15 centimeters away from the pulse generator is achieved. But still, it has got a much higher propensity to cause dysfunction than a bipolar. So bipolar current is what is recommended, and that too at the lowest amplitude. So whenever any of these forms of EMI or electromagnetic interference sources are used, you should always monitor for the pulse, a hand on the pulse, or pulse oximetry plethysmograph, or direct arterial pressure monitor. So a defibrillator with pacemaker function and a temporary pulse generator should be available in the premises. So like I said, always attach some transcutaneous paddles in the AP configuration for use emergency use. So whenever you cardiovert or defibrillate a patient, they have what is called a Zener diode. So this redirects so it's like a surge protector. Whenever we use an external device, we always use what is called a surge protector. So this diverts the DC voltage surge energy directly to the electrode, ensuring delivery to the myocardium. And with AICDs, there are something called capacitive coupling, and this may result in energy being discharged directly at the electrode myocardium interface. So what can happen is, if there is no Zener diode, then this can cause failure transiently for capture of rhythm, or sometimes in permanent failure. But in all new devices have a Zener diode incorporated in them. So basically, we have issues with the implantable devices, especially when we are working in remote locations, and or there are other procedures that we are doing for them. So the first or the biggest problem is, how do you take them for imaging? So MRI is something that has signals of 30 to 300 hertz, and so a reed switch within the device closes, and an asynchronous, sorry, this should read VOO pacing. So the reed switch will close and an asynchronous VVO pacing can occur. Or there could be inhibition of pacing or could be rapid pacing. So this can result in discomfort at the site or death or heating of the electrode tip. So now at least a lot of these devices are what are called MR safe devices. So they can be subjected to magnetic resonance imaging very safely. Whereas older devices are what are called MR non-conditional. That means they are not safe in magnetic resonance field. So the others, of course, is if you are doing some radio frequency ablation, say skin lesions when you are doing RF ablation, or you are doing RF ablation for conduction abnormalities, you should keep the current path as far away from the pulse generator and the lead. The other situation is when you are using shockwave lithotripsy for renal stones or calculi. So you should avoid focus of a beam near the pulse generator. So if the patient is in atrial pacing, so disable the atrial pacing, and if system triggers on the R wave, then you should be careful about it by disabling the atrial pacing. And the lithotripter should be at least 6 inches away from the device. Otherwise, it can cause problems. So because the lithotripsy is usually timed to the electrocardiogram, you have to deactivate all kinds of rate modulation or programming so that it does not interfere with the functioning of the pulse generator. So the use of these following therapies, or at least some of them, is not contraindicated because this is basically in patients with oncology. Radiation therapy is considered very safe, and a non-neutron beam is what is meant to be used so that it can minimize the risk of device reset if the patient is completely pacemaker dependent. So when you are using a neutron beam, if a non-neutron is not available, you have to evaluate the function of the device every week. And if the treatment requires that the beam should be directed, say breast cancer for example, then the pulse generator should be relocated. So it is subclavicular position normally, so on just above the breast, so it can interfere with treatment. So generally the device pulse generator is relocated to the area where it will not interfere with the treatment. So though radiation therapy per se is, and especially a non-neutron beam is considered safe, this must be one of the considerations. Say like example is mastectomy or cancer, breast cancer. Again, electroconvulsive therapy, there are no effects or permanent damage of the device. What can cause a problem is seizure activity following giving a electroconvulsive therapy for the patient. So this can cause prolonged oversensing. So you must make sure the patient gets his anti-epileptic medication. So in some patients, say who are unable to, or who might not be, who have to have say multiple or maybe bipolar disorders or something, reprogramming to an asynchronous mode might be appropriate for these patients. And defibrillator function of an AICD should be disabled, which is the anti-tachydysrhythmia function as recommended by the ACC-AHA, because it can cause inappropriate shocks to the myocardium. Transcutaneous electrical nerve stimulation is something that is used generally for, say, pain or for, say, labor or things like that. So, chronic pain patients are treated. So, impulses via multiple spring electrodes can happen. So, these are why you use so many impulses or so many electrodes. Generally, minimum use is 4. So, they are in the range of 20 to 110 hertz, with the rectangular pulse waves of 1 to 200 volts with a 60 mA current. So theoretically, these can cause pacemaker inhibition. So asymptomatic inhibition on ambulatory monitoring can happen if the patient keeps on a TENS device and keeps walking around. So, or it can also happen when there are unipolar program devices, whereas this is safe with bipolar pacemakers and defibrillators. So whenever you have a patient coming for pain therapy, please remember that even a transcutaneous electrical nerve stimulator can cause some amount of problems to us. So what do you do with these patients after they have anesthesia? post-operative care is very important. They should have continuous monitoring in a high dependency unit, and they should undergo a full telemetric check and reprogramming if you have programmed it by telemetry or disabled all the anti-tachycardia function basically required based on the requirements of the surgery. So they should be reprogrammed to their original settings before you send them out of the high dependency unit. So even in the post-operative care, you should continue to monitor them as long as their device is not reprogrammed. So what are the recommendations? The class 1 recommendations for perioperative management are patients with ICDs who have a preoperative reprogramming to inactivate tachytherapy should be on cardiac monitoring continuously during the entire period of inactivity. It is very important. And an external defibrillator equipment should be readily available. The system should be in place to ensure that ICDs are reprogrammed to active therapy before discontinuation of cardiac monitoring and discharge from the facility. This is level C evidence. So finally, we must understand, of course, that pacemakers, even in the presence of a pacemaker, they can still have death can happen, and these function for or continue to function. So this could be for various reasons. So how do you dispose of these devices in case a patient is deceased? So the basic problem is that the lithium batteries can explode if these patients are cremated. So if they are buried, it's all right, but there is a risk of explosion with lithium batteries. So the other issue, of course, is you should know whether the device malfunctions resulting in death. So technically, all of them should be explanted and they should be interrogated after death to know the cause, and they should be sent to the manufacturer for finding out whether it was because of malfunction of the device that the death was caused. More important is, like I said, it's a very important, very expensive sort of proposition to have pacemakers. So there is a small, what shall I say, move to reuse, and this has been more lives could be saved and supported by patients, families, and the medical community, manufacturers, and the government. So there was an article in circulation about 10 years ago. So these devices were explanted, sent back to the manufacturer for complete overhaul of the function, sterilized and brought back. But there would always be questions about proper sterilization or reuse of equipment like this after death. So to conclude, basically we will see a lot of patients with these devices coming for anesthesia in various situations. And of course, one must understand that whenever an intervention like a pacemaker or a CID is done, they would obviously be well optimized or rehabilitated. So for us to prevent any mishaps from happening, you have to understand the complete thorough functioning of the device, the associated problems, comorbidities. You should do a proper assessment of the device, and the perioperative plan of management should be in place after discussion with the family and the surgical team so that you prevent any mishaps from happening. Remember that all dysrhythmias end with a flat line. So thank you for listening patiently.